الله أكبر. حلب حي صلاح الدين.
Heavy bombardment is launched on Salah ad-Din neighborhood in Aleppo and more than 70 people die in Syria today. Defections in Syria increase and the Syrian Freedom Army proposes a project for the transitional period. The U.S. Defense Minister demands to keep the Syrian army after al-Assad's departure. Welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. The Syrian Human Rights Network documented in the report today the death of 72 victims, mostly in Idlib and Deir ez-Zor, including 5 women and a child. Meanwhile, violent shelling continued on the neighborhood of Al-Sukkari, Salah ad-Din, Al-Ansari, Al-Fard and Al-Maysar in Aleppo. The shelling coincided with heavy flight of helicopters amid violent clashes that took place in the neighborhood of Salah ad-Din and Al-Salihin and Al-Maysar. And activists reported that Syrian Freedom Army controlled the Bab al-Nayrab police station, and they were able to capture 40 members of the regime forces, including a colonel, while the shelling was renewed on the towns of Hayyan, Anjara, and Hraytan in the northern suburbs of Aleppo, destroying several houses. Meanwhile, the Human Rights Network documented the death of 130 victims yesterday, mostly in Aleppo, Damascus, and Daraa.
في إصلاحات بشار. دكتور ممكن تحكي لنا بس شوي عن العملية؟ إصابة بالبطن.
The city of Aleppo is also witnessing poor medical conditions due to the military operations in several neighborhoods. In addition, the regime forces controls the public and private hospitals, while doctors send distress calls for help.
إصابة في الصدر، هنا إصابة في اليد.
طيب ممكن بس اللي على الإصابات تعتزك اليوم؟
أنا العقيد هيثم درويش، نعلن عن تشكيل لواء الفتح في مدينة حلب.
Meanwhile, Colonel Haytham Darwish and the Freedom Syrian Army announced the formation of Al-Fath Brigade in Aleppo and its countryside, which includes many of the battalions and the military units.
من قلب الحدث الذي تعيشه سوريا نعلن بعون الله تعالى وتوفيقه عن تشكيل لواء الفتح التابع
Staying in Aleppo, where activists broadcasted pictures yesterday of the Colonel Abdel Jaber Aqidi, the head of the military in Aleppo, inspecting members of the Syrian Freedom Army stationed in the neighborhood of Aleppo, where he visited the neighborhood of Bab al-Hadid and other neighborhoods.
For 3 days, the regime was trying to take control of Salah ad-Din, but its attempts have failed and it suffered heavy losses in human life, weapons and tanks. They were forced to give up. Our goals are not for the coming months, but we have goals for the coming days. Within days, Aleppo will be liberated. Our battle is a street war with the regime. We liberated some areas and are trying to establish stability as soon as we secure our areas. Then we will move forward to other neighborhoods in the direction of the city center. We will liberate Aleppo and all its security sites.
The UN Refugee Agency said today that Aleppo residents who haven't been able to flee the violence between rebels and the Syrian government forces are seeking shelter in schools and other public buildings. The spokesperson, Melissa Fleming, told reporters that agency's office in Aleppo was severely constrained because of the security measures.
We are trying our best to help the people in the schools. For example, there are 32 schools in Aleppo that we've identified, and in each of those schools we've heard or witnessed that 250 to 350 people were packed inside, many of these families, kids, and then in university dormitories there are a total of some 7,000 people staying in the dormitory rooms, hoping to seek safety from the continuing shelling and the continuing violence.
And to discuss more the situation in Aleppo, with us on the phone, Abu Marwan, an activist from Aleppo. Abu Marwan, welcome into our bulletin. First of all, I want you to update us on the latest updates in Aleppo. Abu Marwan, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes.
Okay, today there were important incidents which is
Okay, so there is a technical problem. We will try to fix it and call Abu Marwan later on. And moving on to Idlib, where 13 victims fell today in the province of Idlib, with a continuation of heavy shelling and shooting by the regime forces, where the bombing was focused on Marshourin, Saraqib and Taftanaz, with rocket-propelled grenades and mortars and helicopters. This was accompanied with the displacement of citizens in Nahlaya, Korin and Filun towards the Al Rouge Valley due to the continued bombing, while huge explosions were heard in the north of Idlib near the College of Arts amid shooting and heavy spread of security.
أثار القصف العشوائي على أحد المنازل في بلدة حيش.
Fierce bombing by heavy artillery was launched from a military airport on the town of Taftanaz in Idlib suburbs, where many rockets fell on and destroyed residential buildings in the city. The bombing also reached the towns of Saraqib, Has and Nayrab, in addition to the village of Mahbal and its schools that were targeted by the regime tanks that were positioned in their village and led to injuring dozens of civilians. The regime forces carried out arrest and robbing campaigns after invading the villages of Failun and Mastoma, where over 20 houses were completely burned after they were robbed by the Shabiha forces of the regime. Over 15,000 citizens in Al-Habid are suffering from a bad humanitarian situation after they were displaced to nearby farms from the bombardment of the regime's planes that bombed the city heavily. In Idlib, explosion sounds were heard in the neighborhood of Al-Labit, Al-Thawra, and near the national hospitals after heavy clashes that took place between the Sinn Féin army and the regime forces. All of these violations, however, did not stop the citizens of Idlib to go out and protest in support of the troubled cities of Kafr Nabil, Has, Kafr Takharim, and Ma'arat al-Nu'man.
And moving on to Damascus, where activists reported hearing sounds of explosions that rocked most of the neighborhoods of the capital Damascus, such as Baghdad Street, Al-Abid, Al-Tijara, and Al-Abbasin. This coincided with heavy fire from the neighborhoods of Nahar Aishi, Kafr Sousse, and Al-Qadam, while 2 victims were killed due to the fall of mortar shells on Al-Zarzour Hall. Meanwhile, violent clashes erupted between the regime forces and members of the Freedom Syrian Army in Al-Yarmouk Palestinian refugee camp amid a campaign of raids and arbitrary arrests of dozens of civilians. And back to Abu Marwan from Aleppo to update us on the situation and the events taking place at this moment. Abu Marwan, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Can you please go ahead and update us on the situation in Aleppo?
Okay, the most important incidents in Aleppo for today was liberating many police departments like Hanano Police Department and Bab al-Nayrab and Al-Salihin, which is the most one of the most police departments in Aleppo because it's near to Al-Marja.
Yes.
And there were a heavy violent clashes between Free Syrian Army and family of Barri, which is the most important Shabiha in Aleppo. And the result was arresting many of Barris, which about 10th of this family, which is the most dangerous family that suppressing the demonstrations in Dole and in Aleppo in general. Okay?
Yes.
There's a very big, very important incidents like Free Syrian Army opening military airport on from set forces.
Abu Marwan, are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm with you. Another important event for today was
Okay, I want to ask you: Yeah, is the bombing and shelling, is it continued until this moment that we speak now?
Yeah.
Which areas exactly?
Still heavy bombardments on Salah ad-Din neighborhood and on Al-Sukkari and on Bab al-Nayrab after the liberating of the police department of Bab al-Nayrab. Okay. And also there's another thing, which is some gunmen break into Palestinian refugee camp in Al-Nayrab neighborhood.
Okay, thank you very much, Abu Marwan from Aleppo, for being with us. To that, shelling with mortars and rocket launchers continue on the cities of Jdeida Artuz and Madaya and Raya and the village of Hosh al-Arab in Damascus suburbs, and this coincided with heavy fire. Meanwhile, the regime forces is besieging the town of Deir al-Asafir amid fears of raids and incursions, while the town also witnessed unusual displacement movement in the past 2 days, and according to the activists, several buildings witnessed missile bombing this morning in the village of Beit Saham, while heavy gunfire was heard in Al Sayyida Zainab.
Gunfire, clashes, shelling, and shooting all night long until the early morning hours today was the case of the Yarmouk refugee camp. Following the clashes between the Assad regime forces and the Syrian Freedom Army, activists reported that rebels attaining control over 3 military tanks in the area. Activists also reported that the Syrian Freedom Army targeted the Assad regime's exclusive headquarters of the Front for the Liberation of Palestine with RPG missiles, along with the regime forces' military barrier near the Palestine hospital in military operations carried out by Muhammad al-Ashmar battalion of the Syrian Freedom Army. The neighborhood of At-Tadaman also witnessed intense military operations during the dawn of today, specifically at the surroundings of At-Tadaman station, which led to many cases of family displacements from the area. In the countryside of Damascus, Harasta, Zamalka, and Jobar witnessed Assad regime warplanes flying at low altitudes, in addition to being targeted by heavy shelling during the early morning hours. Furthermore, the Musab bin Umayr battalion of the Syrian Freedom Army was able to secure large amounts of ammunition and weapons near the town of Harasta. With increased violence in the capital and its surroundings, here are still cries of distress for freedom and support of the afflicted Syrian cities.
And coming up later in the bulletin, Al-Arabi says that those responsible for the crimes in Syria should be punished. And welcome back. You're watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. We continue in Deir ez-Zor, where 10 victims were murdered and several others were wounded today after the city witnessed a bombing amid escalating clashes between al-Assad regime forces and the Syrian Freedom Army. This heavy artillery shelling rocked the neighborhood of Al-Sheikh Yassin and Al-Hamidiyya, with artillery stationed at At-Tala'a military barrier. The fields of the city also witnessed heavy shelling, where the families reported the drop of dozens of missiles since the early morning hours. The regime's military operations in Dar'a continue, where cities of Al-Yaduda, Khirbat Ghazali, Da'al, Al-Lajat and Tafas witnessed heavy shelling with artillery and rocket launchers, and activists reported that dozens of missiles fell, targeting civilian houses in the area and destructing many of them.
جرحى جراء القصف العشوائي
Voices from the minarets of mosques are only becoming louder, however not with calls to prayer but with calls to blood donation, as the number of wounded victims losing mass amounts of blood has increased dramatically with the increase in violent bombing by the Assad regime forces in Daraa. The town of Western Ghariya is still being subjected to another demoralizing bombardment by the Assad regime forces artillery. In addition, many other towns in Daraa were exposed to intense campaigns of raids and arbitrary arrests during mass displacements seeking safe neighboring areas. Military reinforcements were deployed at the Palestinian refugee camp after the bombing by the regime's military aviation and artillery, where columns of smoke reached the sky, where the same situation was repeated in Daraa city. Meanwhile, defections from the Assad regime army pile up as more of the regime army's soldiers declare their official disloyalty to the Assad regime to join the Syrian Freedom Army. Moreover, violent gunfire clashes went down between the Assad regime forces and the Syrian Freedom Army in the numerous neighborhoods of Daraa today, where some clashes actually reached the Jordanian border.
And moving on to Homs, where several were killed and injured due to the random bombing that targeted the neighborhood of Baba Amr and As-Sultaniya and the old neighborhoods of Homs. Meanwhile, the shelling was renewed on the towns and the villages of Al-Rastan, Talbisi, Al-Qsir, which led to the fall of many victims, including women and children, in addition to finding 2 unknown bodies on the borders with Lebanon. Furthermore, activists reported that a big number of soldiers defected from the regime's army on the security barrier amid heavy clashes between the Syrian Freedom Army and the regime forces. To the province of Hama, where shelling was renewed on the towns of Tibet Imam, Kafar Zeta, and Kaukab, and many others. Also, explosion sounds were heard in Al Qusur neighborhood that was followed by heavy gunfire shooting. Meanwhile, the regime's army invaded last night the towns of Kafar Nabuda and Al Trimsis, supported by a big number of tanks and military vehicles. And to the province of Latakia, where mortar shelling was renewed on the area of El Maruniyat, where 5 shells would hit the area every 1 minute. Meanwhile, the regime forces implemented traps on the barriers of the regime, and also shelling was targeting residential houses using rocket launchers and heavy artillery that are positioned all around the cities. Coming up in the bulletin, Al-Arabi says that those responsible for the crimes in Syria should be punished. Welcome back. The Center of Communication and Strategic Research stated that the death toll in Syria reached 22,444 citizens. And according to the statistics, the number of children who were killed reached 1,743, and approximately 1,736 were women, in addition to 1,627 soldiers, and 830 died under torture. The Syrian Freedom Army provided a project to save Syria during the transitional period. The project suggests on a building of a higher council for defense and to form a presidential council of 6 military and political figures that will manage the transition in Syria after the fall of al-Assad, in addition to forming a transitional government headed by Malham Droubi, which contains 31 ministers, including Abdel Basit Sida as a Minister of Foreign Affairs and Burhan Ghalioun as a Minister of Expatriate Affairs. The Syrian Freedom Army also declared in a statement issued yesterday that it called the project for the national salvation, which meets the full requirements of the revolution, and that the council will include all the military leaders of the military tribunals in the Syrian cities and provinces, senior officers, dissidents, in addition to the officers who contributed in the revolution. And one of the functions of the Presidential Council is to suggest laws to be given to the general referendum, in addition to restricting the security and military institutions on the national basis, and to develop solutions to accommodate the civilian Syrians who took up arms during the revolution in military and security institutions. Arab League Secretary General Nabil Arabi said today that war crimes are being committed in Aleppo and those responsible should be punished under international law. In his meeting with Bulgaria's foreign minister at the League of headquarters in Cairo, he said that important diplomatic initiatives were underway to end the violence in Syria.
There
are very important international developments. First of all, there is a decision in the United Nations General Assembly that has been resolved and may be voted upon on Wednesday. And also France has requested an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council at foreign ministers level. And there will be a discussion and an honest confrontation of the current situation. The French government has said they wish to discuss the transitional period, and it is important. In addition to the unfortunate events that have been taking place in Syria, which words can't describe, though I did not speak about the massacre that is taking place in Aleppo and other areas, and said they can be considered, in reality, risen to the level of war crimes, which can be punished under the international law.
The United Nations General Assembly is set to vote on an initiative by the Arab states calling for a democratic transition in Syria. A resolution the Bulgarian Foreign Minister Nikolai Mladenov said his country supports.
We're very concerned with the continuing situation in Syria. We discussed the challenges, as Ambassador Al-Arabi just stated. We will also support the resolution in the UN in the UN General Assembly. I hope that we can see our friends in the Syrian opposition organize more quickly to implement what, under the auspices of the Arab League, that they have achieved.
Many defections occurred yesterday after 2 diplomats and 12 generals announced their split from the regime's army and their joining of the revolution against al-Assad. Meanwhile, the consulate and the deputy chief said the mission in the Syrian embassy in Nigeria, Khalid Salah, announced his split from the Syrian regime, and the foreign ministry in London also announced earlier the split of the chief of affairs in London, Khalid Ayyubi. The Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan and the U.S. President Barack Obama discussed on how to work together to accelerate the political transition in Syria. And in a statement issued by the office of Erdogan, which said that the talks dealt with the coordination of efforts to accelerate the process of political transition in Syria, including the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad and the implementation of the legitimate demands of the Syrian people. The two sides also discussed their concern over the deteriorating humanitarian conditions in Syria, especially after the regime started attacking Aleppo. And from his side, the U.S. Defense Secretary John Panetta said that it is important to keep the government forces in Syria coherent when al-Assad is ousted from power, warning of another Iraq situation. Panetta added that Syria's stability is an important point that should be considered during any plan that includes the oust of al-Assad. Panetta also emphasized the importance of seeking to maintain the stability in Syria after al-Assad's departure, and that it is important to keep as much as possible from the army and the police as well as the security forces after the transition to a democratic government. And before we wrap up, here's another look at today's top stories. Heavy bombardment is launched on Salah ad-Din neighborhood in Aleppo, and more than 70 people die in Syria today. Defections in Syria increase, and the Syrian Freedom Army proposes a project for the transitional period. The U.S. Defense Minister demands to keep the Syrian army after al-Assad's departure. And with this, we end our news bulletin from Orient TV. For more updates about the Syrian revolution, please visit our Facebook page. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.